Louis the Pious, the king who let the church rule the crown. Louis the Pious was born in 778, the only surviving son of Charlemagne to make it to adulthood. From childhood, he was serious, prayerful, and rule-bound, exactly the kind of monarch church leaders dreamed of guiding. When he took the throne of the Carolingian Empire in 814, it stretched across almost all of Western Europe, 20 million people, unified by his father's wars and Christian mission. But Louis wasn't Charlemagne. He replaced his father's iron discipline with confession and guilt. The bishops quickly saw that weakness. They told him royal power should serve moral renewal, and he agreed. He let churchmen like Benedict of Anian reform monasteries and lecture nobles, turning the palace into a religious court instead of a warrior one. In 822, after rebellious nobles accused him of arrogance, Louis shocked Europe. He stood barefoot before the clergy and publicly confessed his sins as emperor. That act, meant to prove faith, actually confirmed that the church could make the most powerful man in the West kneel. From then on, popes and bishops judged him, his sons defied him, and civil war tore the empire apart. By the time Louis died in 840, the empire was collapsing into the rival kingdoms of Charles the Bald, Lothar, and Louis the German. His devotion hadn't saved the empire. It had given the clergy more political weight than ever. Historians today call him the saint who made kings weak, and through him, medieval Europe learned a lesson that lasted for centuries. When a ruler surrenders conscience to the church, power never truly stays with the crown. Charles the Bald, 823 to 877, the crown that needed a bishop's permission. Charles the Bald was the youngest son of Louis the Pious, and his whole life proved how deeply the church could sit inside royal politics. When his father's empire was torn apart by civil wars, Charles's share, West Francia, roughly modern France, was unstable, nobles bigger than loyalty, clergy richer than generals. To survive, he leaned completely on the bishops. He courted the church with gifts and promises. Over 300 charters from his reign show him granting abbeys new lands or immunity. In return, the clergy declared his rule ordained by God, even when warriors saw him as weak. The Archbishop Hincmar of Reims became his mentor, ghostwriter, and occasional leash. He drafted royal decrees, corrected Louis the Pious's old laws, and reminded the king that rebellion against a consecrated monarch was a sin, but also that a sinful monarch could lose God's grace. This moral trap kept Charles obedient. When Viking raids hit Paris in 845 and 885, his military failures deepened dependence on the church's legitimacy campaigns. He wore humility like armor. Religious ceremonies replaced victory parades. By the end of his reign, the crown was surviving almost entirely through church administration. It worked, temporarily. West Francia didn't vanish, but kings after him inherited a throne tangled in monastery privileges and clerical influence. Charles proved that faith could build a wall around power just as easily as it could defend it. I Tzimiskes, 969 to 976, the emperor who ruled on his knees. When I Tzimiskes seized the Byzantine throne in 969 after the assassination of Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas, he was a soldier with blood on his hands and a patriarch watching for repentance. The moment mattered. Byzantine claimed to be God's empire on earth. Killing a crowned servant of Christ made John a sinner before he was a sovereign. The patriarch Polyeuctus refused to crown him unless he submitted to strict penance. So, in the Hagia Sophia, John publicly confessed, promised to protect widows and orphans, and swore to expel his powerful mistress, the Empress Theophano, who had helped engineer the murder. Only after that humiliation did he receive the crown. For the rest of his 6-year reign, he ruled as a kind of holy deputy, fighting wars, yes, but constantly proclaiming that victory belonged to God, not to him. He flooded charities with imperial funds, rebuilt churches in Antioch and Jerusalem, and let the patriarch bless every major campaign. Militarily, he was brilliant. He crushed Arab forces and restored Byzantine control over parts of Syria and Mesopotamia, but politically, he stayed boxed inside clerical approval. Even his death felt symbolic, taken by sudden illness after a fast. Some said poisoned, some said punished for pride. I Tzimiskes left Byzantine stronger on the map, but more firmly tied to the idea that divine sanction, not emperor's will, made law. He reminded an empire built by warriors that even a conqueror could be conquered by the church. Otto III, 980 to 1002, the emperor who tried to build heaven on earth. Otto III was only 15 when he inherited the Holy Roman Empire in 996. He'd been educated by bishops, steeped in Latin theology, and convinced he was chosen to fuse Rome's empire with the Church's holiness. It sounded divine. In practice, it made him a ruler run by priests. He elevated his tutor, Gerbert of Aurillac, a scholar-monk later known as Pope Sylvester II, and imagined himself a spiritual emperor reviving Christian Rome. He paraded barefoot through holy sites, called himself Servant of the Apostles, and moved his capital to Rome so he could live beside the Pope. But that closeness made him vulnerable. Every decree bore papal fingerprints. Every imperial policy needed blessing. When revolts erupted in Italy and Poland, Otto refused to punish rebels harshly, saying Christ's mercy was his only weapon. To nobles, that wasn't mercy, it was weakness. In 1007, a Roman riot forced him to flee, humiliated. The next year, he died young, barely 22, from fever or poison. Otto's dream of the Holy Empire died with him, yet his ideal left an enduring mark. Medieval rulers afterward spoke as patrons of faith, not owners of it. Otto III proved how devotion can turn an emperor into a missionary and a monarch into a minister of the church. Henry IV, 1050 to 1106, the emperor who walked barefoot to forgiveness. Few moments in medieval history show power flipping so dramatically. Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, inherited the throne at 6, crowned by bishops who believed emperors ruled through the church, not above it. As a grown man, Henry pushed back, insisting he had the right to appoint bishops himself. The Pope, Gregory VII, excommunicated him. In 1077, freezing winter in the Italian Alps, Henry crossed the mountains barefoot, wearing a hair shirt, standing in snow outside Canossa Castle for 3 days, begging forgiveness. The sight shocked Europe. A man ruling millions kneeling to one priest. Gregory finally lifted the excommunication, but victory came at a price. The empire understood which side truly held moral power. Henry later fought back, even invaded Rome, but his image never recovered. Rebels used the Pope's curse as justification to crown a rival emperor. Civil war shattered Germany, and by the end, Henry was dethroned by his own son. His reign didn't end papal dominance, it cemented it. The investiture controversy proved spiritual legitimacy could outweigh swords and armies. For centuries after, kings knelt in policy even when they stood in battle, all haunted by the memory of Henry IV shivering in the snow. King John of England, 1166 to 1216, the king who rented England to the Pope. King John began infamous for losing wars and money, but his true submission came not to France but to Rome. In 1205, John refused to accept Pope Innocent III's choice of Archbishop Stephen Langton for Canterbury. The Pope retaliated with a full interdict, churches locked, bells silenced, no weddings, no funerals. England spiritually shut down for 6 long years. Excommunicated, John faced rebellion from his own barons and threatened invasion from France. Cornered, he flipped the board. In 1213, he performed a dramatic act, kneeling before the papal legate and handing over the entire kingdom as a papal fief. In exchange, Rome restored him to grace and promised protection. Overnight, England became a tenant of the Vatican, owing yearly tribute of £1,000, a fortune then. John regained the Pope's support, but lost everything else at home. His nobles forced the Magna Carta in 1215 to contain his power, and within a year he died distrusted and debt-ridden. Yet his surrender set a precedent lasting decades. Papal approval could make or unmake English kings. It exposed how political obedience could masquerade as piety, and how fear of excommunication could turn a monarch into a client.
King John wasn't just the villain of Robin Hood, he was the man who literally leased his crown to the church.
James II of Aragon, 1267 to 1327, the Crusader under contract. James II inherited the Aragonese throne in 1291, a kingdom already entangled in papal politics after his father conquered Sicily against church wishes. When he came to power, Pope Boniface VIII offered him a deal. If James abandoned claims to forbidden Sicily and instead led crusades approved by Rome, his crown and conscience would stay safe. That bargain bound his entire reign. He accepted. Papal envoys dictated which islands he could invade, when to halt wars, and even arranged marriages. James wed 2 papally chosen brides to secure treaties blessed by heaven. He called himself the Church's most obedient son and fought campaigns in Sardinia and Corsica, claiming for the faith, but these were really papal wars for political map-making. Every victory strengthened the Pope, not Aragon. At home, nobles complained that the treasury served Rome, not Barcelona. Yet James couldn't break free. Each disobedience came with threats of excommunication. When he died, Aragon held scattered islands but lost independence in foreign policy. James II learned that papal promises made a kingdom respectable in Europe, but only so long as it obeyed like a vassal knight. Robert of Naples, 1277 to 1343, the bank manager of God. If medieval banking had saints, Robert of Naples would be its accountant-in-chief. Known as Robert the Wise, he ruled after his father Charles II had driven the papal allies into debt and disorder. To fix it, he presented himself as the Pope's perfect servant while running Italy's richest city. Trusted him so completely that when the papacy moved north to Avignon, Robert became its southern protector and financier. He lent soldiers, lent money, and lent legitimacy. Bishops wrote that his kingdom was the anchor of the church. In return, the Pope called him Vicar of Christ in Italy, a title that made him sound like deputy pope rather than sovereign king. Under his rule, Naples prospered culturally. The city grew to over 60,000 people. Scholars and painters flocked there. But politically, every major decision needed papal consent. His wars in Tuscany, his peace treaties, even his succession plans came stamped by cardinals. When Robert died childless, papal lawyers helped choose his granddaughter's husband to preserve holy order, and once again Naples fell to infighting. Robert's wisdom kept the throne stable but chained. He proved a king could gain every blessing in writing and still rule on the church's payroll. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, 1361 to 1419. The crown caged clerics. Wenceslaus IV began his reign with promise, a son of Emperor Charles IV, raised in luxury, fluent in Latin, crowned King of Bohemia at 15. But his capital, Prague, was the theological heart of Europe, where the Church's command met a restless public hungry for reform. At first, Archbishop Jan of Jenstein and the Pope treated Wenceslaus as their model monarch. They crowned him twice, advised policy, and used his name to enforce moral censorship. Yet Wenceslaus grew unpredictable, favoring Czech reformers like Jan Hus, who questioned clerical corruption. The bishops revolted, not with armies but with influence. They suspended church services, called him lazy and drunk, and spread whispers of heresy. In 1400, the German electors used papal disapproval as an excuse to depose him as Holy Roman Emperor. In Bohemia, unrest deepened. Clergy helped turn his nobles against him. He was even imprisoned by his own brothers for months while the church supported more reliable rulers. By his death in 1419, the kingdom was torn between loyalists and Hussite radicals, sliding toward religious war. Wenceslaus's reign showed the paradox of faith and authority. The church made him king, and the same church unmade him when he questioned its power.
Henry VI of England, 1421 to 1471, the saint who forgot to rule. Henry VI became king at only 9 months old after his father, Henry V, died a war hero. England's future warrior king turned out anything but. Deeply gentle, more monk than monarch, he spent hours in prayer and funded colleges at Eton and Cambridge while his nobles tore each other apart. From childhood, he was surrounded by regents, mostly churchmen who ruled through him. His chaplains and confessors decided royal policy, and sermons shaped council meetings. By his 20s, he'd suffered bouts of catatonic withdrawal, and clerics ran the court entirely, preaching that submission was godly and vengeance sinful. Poor lessons for a man presiding over the Wars of the Roses. In 1453, he lapsed into a year-long breakdown, just as England lost all its lands in France. Queen Margaret and Richard of York fought to protect him, but both used him as a religious symbol of legitimacy. Chroniclers noted that whenever crisis struck, Henry ordered nationwide prayers instead of armies. Captured, freed, and captured again, he ended his life murdered in the Tower of London, whispered to be a saint, remembered as a shadow. His reign proved that holiness without strength turns kingship into a chapel service, peaceful, pious, and powerless. Mary I of England, 1516 to 1558, the throne restored to Rome. Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, became England's first crowned queen in 1553, burning with a single mission: undo her father's break with Rome. For her, this wasn't policy, it was salvation. Within months, she repealed Protestant laws, restored papal supremacy, and brought in Cardinal Reginald Pole, cousin and confidant, as Archbishop of Canterbury. Pole became her conscience and compass. Through him, the Vatican directed every step. Church property returned, bishops reinstalled, heresy commissions formed. When rebellions like Wyatt's revolt flared, Pole advised that mercy invited sin. The result, over 280 Protestants burned at the stake, earning her the grim title Bloody Mary. Married to Spain's Philip II, she imagined a united Catholic empire, but real power drifted toward continental advisors and clergy. When she died childless in 1558, England swung back to Protestantism under Elizabeth. Mary I's reign lasted just 5 years, but rewired Europe's sense of religious politics. She showed how a sovereign's personal faith, when fused to papal authority, could turn conviction into policy, devotion into terror, and monarchy into the Church's most devoted weapon. Sigismund III Vasa of Poland-Sweden, 1566 to 1632, the Jesuit king. Sigismund III Vasa wore 2 crowns, Poland's and Sweden's, and owed them both to Rome. Raised by Jesuit tutors, he believed kingship was a divine mission to fight the Reformation. His court in Krakow became a training ground for Catholic zeal, its policies drafted by priests rather than politicians. When he tried to enforce Catholicism across multi-faith Poland, nobles rebelled. In Sweden, his Protestant subjects expelled him altogether in 1599, crowning his uncle instead. Still, Sigismund treated every setback as proof of holy trial. Jesuit confessor Piotr Skarga guided his diplomacy, urging him to side with the Pope in every continental dispute. Poland's wars against Orthodox Russia and Protestant Sweden became de facto crusades. Sigismund minted coins bearing both his portrait and the Virgin Mary's, built 30-plus churches, and banned printing without clerical oversight. Economically, the realm suffered, yet the papacy hailed him as defender of the faith. After decades of warfare and failed unifications, he left Poland impoverished and divided, but spiritually militant. Sigismund III Vasa stands as the Baroque image of faith over statecraft, the king who ruled by catechism first and constitution second, proving the Church's grip could steer a whole kingdom's destiny.
Louis XIII of France, 1601 to 1643, the king who wore the cardinal's crown. Louis XIII inherited France at 9 years old. A frightened child ruled first by his mother, Marie de Medici, then by her chosen advisor, Cardinal Richelieu. What began as mentorship became submission.
Richelieu wasn't just a cleric, he was an architect of state who believed God's order ran through the church's hand, not the king's. Louis adored stability more than control, so he let the cardinal command. Richelieu decided foreign policy, led armies, and even signed royal decrees. By the 1630s, ambassadors abroad described France as a bishopric with an army. When nobles plotted, Louis hesitated. Richelieu built prisons. When Protestants fortified La Rochelle, the cardinal staged a siege that starved 20,000 people, then thanked heaven in Louis's name. Through it all, the king prayed, hunted, and approved edicts others wrote. Yet this strange partnership worked. France's population soared past 20 million, and royal authority crushed feudal lords once and for all. Louis XIII ended respected, but half invisible. The monarch who proved a ruler could save a kingdom by surrendering real power to a priest with vision wider than his own. Charles III of Spain, 1716 to 1788, the reluctant reformer, tamed by piety. Before Charles III became Spain's enlightened despot, he was a devout Bourbon trained to rule in obedience to Rome. When he took the Spanish throne in 1759, the Jesuits guided his conscience, pushing him to cleanse society rather than modernize it. For nearly a decade, sermons outweighed science, and state papers began with prayers longer than plans. But the same clerics who taught obedience soon turned on him when reform threatened privilege. After food riots in 1766, church leaders blamed royal impiety. Charles bowed first, ordering public penance, but later struck back, expelling all 6,000 Jesuits in 1767. It was history's sharpest swing from puppet to master. Still, the church's grip lingered. Every reform needed theological approval, every tax decree a nod from bishops. Spain modernized unevenly, half laboratory, half monastery. By his death, Charles III had revived colonial wealth and reformed urban life, yet his own epitaph described him as the most obedient son of the church. His reign showed how even rational kings in the Age of Reason moved with one eye on the altar candle, measuring progress by what Rome allowed to burn.
Ferdinand VII of Spain, the last servant of the Inquisition. Born under empire, crowned amid revolution, Ferdinand VII should have been a modern monarch. Instead, when Napoleon captured him in 1808, Spain's clergy recast him as a martyr king, God's prisoner. When rebels forced the French out, crowds hailed him as the chosen of heaven. And in 1814, the church staged his return to power, carrying sacred banners beside royal ones. The moment he touched Madrid's soil, bishops urged him to abolish the liberal constitution written in his absence. He obeyed instantly, restored the Inquisition, and imprisoned reformers. For nearly 20 years, friars dominated councils, censored printing, and preached that rebellion was sin. Even when Spain's colonies revolted across the Americas, Ferdinand refused compromise, believing divine right outweighed blood and treasure. By the 1820s, his nation was bankrupt, half its empire gone, yet the pulpits still called him El Rey Católico. When he died in 1833, Spain fell into new civil wars, the Carlist conflicts, fought over whether church or parliament defined the crown. Ferdinand VII closed the medieval chapter of monarchy controlled by the church, proof that blind devotion can preserve a throne's ritual long after it loses every earthly kingdom.